I don't care what the contract says, Jerry. Make the damn numbers work or I'll find someone who can. The voice boomed across the storm-lashed tarmac of Westchester County Airport, cutting through the howling October wind like a blade. But power doesn't announce itself with noise, it whispers with absolute certainty. And sitting quietly in the leather seat of a $75 million private jet, a woman in a faded MIT hoodie was about to teach the loudest man in the cabin exactly what real power looked like. Richard Blackwood thought he knew power. He wore it in his $8,000 Tom Ford suit, flashed it with his Patek Philippe watch, and wielded it like a weapon whenever someone dared to inconvenience him. When he looked at the woman in seat 1A, black skin, casual clothes, beaten leather bag, he saw exactly what his privileged world had taught him to see. Nobody important. In exactly 47 minutes, this assumption would cost him everything. His career, his freedom, his million-dollar reputation, and his marriage would all crumble because he couldn't imagine that the woman he was about to humiliate owned the very aircraft beneath his feet. Before we dive into this story of justice at 40,000 feet, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you've ever been underestimated because of how you look, hit that subscribe button because this story is your vindication. What you're about to witness isn't just karma, it's a masterclass in how dignity defeats arrogance every single time. Now let's step aboard the Phoenix, where entitlement and reality are about to collide in the most expensive way possible. The storm had been pounding the East Coast for 6 hours, turning the Thursday evening sky into a churning mass of black clouds and lightning. Inside the Phoenix, a Bombardier Global 8000 that represented the pinnacle of private aviation engineering, the atmosphere should have been calm, controlled, luxurious. Instead, tension filled the cabin like smoke. Amara Davis sat in seat 1A, her eyes closed, finally experiencing her first moment of quiet in 96 hours. At 42, she was the CEO of Vanguard Logistics, a company she'd built from nothing into a $2.3 billion empire that moved freight across 4 continents. She'd just closed the acquisition deal of her career, purchasing 3 competing firms in a negotiation marathon that had pushed her to the edge of exhaustion. She didn't look like the cover of Forbes. She didn't look like a woman who'd just orchestrated one of the largest logistics mergers in Silicon Valley history. She wore a charcoal MIT hoodie that had seen better decades, faded jeans with a small rip in the knee, and sneakers that had walked through countless airport terminals. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, revealing the deep exhaustion etched under her dark eyes. The beaten leather bag at her feet was a Hermes Hack 40 apiece that cost more than most people's cars, but Amara had used it so aggressively over the past 5 years that it looked like a thrift store find to the untrained eye. That was exactly the point. Amara Davis had spent her entire adult life being watched, judged, and underestimated. When she traveled, she preferred invisibility. The Phoenix wasn't just any private jet. It was her aircraft held through a blind trust that she controlled, managed by a charter company to offset operational costs. The cost-sharing program allowed vetted partners to purchase empty seats on corporate flights, but Amara's identity as the actual owner remained carefully hidden behind layers of corporate structure. "Would you like another glass, Ms. Davis?" Isabella Rodriguez. The flight attendant spoke softly as she approached seat 1A. Isabella had flown with Amara dozens of times over the past 3 years. She knew the drill: no fanfare, no formal address in front of other passengers, just professional quiet. "Please," Amara murmured, her voice raspy from days of nonstop meetings. The 25-year Macallan in her crystal tumbler was exactly what her body needed. "How much longer until we can get out of here? Captain Santos says the storm should break in about 15 minutes. Then it's smooth sailing to San Francisco." Isabella replied with a warm, professional smile. She'd seen Amara at her most exhausted before, knew exactly how to provide comfort without drawing attention. The cabin of the Global 8000 was configured for maximum luxury, 14 cream leather seats arranged in clusters, mahogany inlays that caught the soft ambient lighting, and gold fixtures that whispered wealth rather than screaming it. The aircraft could seat up to 19 passengers, but tonight only 4 seats were occupied through the cost-sharing program. Amara took a sip of the burning amber liquid and felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Outside the oval windows, rain lashed against the glass in sheets, distorting the lights of the terminal into abstract patterns. For the first time in 4 days, she allowed herself to truly relax. But peace was about to be shattered. The sound came first heavy footsteps on the aircraft stairs, accompanied by a voice that seemed genetically designed to irritate. "I don't care if it's raining sideways, Miguel. We need to be wheels up in 10 minutes, or I miss the most important meeting of my career." Richard Blackwood appeared in the cabin doorway like a storm front given human form. At 48, he was the managing partner of Pinnacle Capital, a hedge fund that specialized in high-risk, high-reward investments that often skirted the edge of legality. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with slicked-back blonde hair, fighting a losing battle against a receding hairline. His navy pinstripe suit was tailored just tight enough to suggest vanity, and his gold Rolex Submariner caught the cabin lights with aggressive flashes. Behind him followed his wife, Sophia Blackwood, a woman who looked like she'd been carved from marble by a sculptor who specialized in tragic beauty. She was stunning in the way that only money could perfect Chanel, from head-to-toe surgical enhancements that were tasteful but obvious, and jewelry that could fund a small country's education budget. But her eyes were empty, exhausted, carrying the weight of a woman who'd traded her soul for security and was beginning to regret the transaction. Sophia carried a small designer dog in a Louis Vuitton carrier, the kind of accessory that screamed trophy wife to anyone paying attention. She said nothing, and she entered the cabin, her gaze fixed on the floor, avoiding eye contact with the other passengers. Richard was still barking into his iPhone 15 Pro Max, his voice filling the cabin with the specific frequency of entitlement. "No, Jerry. I'm boarding now. I'll call you once we're airborne. Just make it work. I don't pay you to tell me something's impossible." He hung up and surveyed the cabin like a general inspecting conquered territory. His eyes catalogued the luxury appointments, probably calculating their cost and comparing them to his own standards. The Phoenix was impressive even by his elevated standards. This level of aircraft was typically reserved for heads of state and titans of industry. Other passengers were already settled. In seats 7A and 7B sat Jake Morrison and Emma Torres, both tech executives in their early 30s, who'd booked the charter flight as a convenient way to reach a startup conference in San Francisco. Jake was a serial entrepreneur who'd built and sold 3 companies, while Emma was a venture capitalist known for her early investments in social media platforms. Both were active on social media, frequently documenting their business travels for their combined hundreds of thousands of followers. Jake had his phone out, casually filming content for his TikTok channel, behind-the-scenes footage of private jet travel that his audience ate up. Emma was reviewing her Instagram stories, planning posts about the flight experience. Neither paid much attention to the tension building in the forward cabin. Richard's eyes swept across the empty seats, then landed on Amara in 1A. He stopped. He frowned. He looked at his boarding pass, then back at the woman curled up with her drink. The calculation happening behind his eyes was ugly and predictable. He didn't see Amara Davis, CEO of Vanguard Logistics, a woman whose net worth exceeded $1.8 billion. He didn't see someone who employed 12,000 people across 3 continents, who'd been featured on the cover of Fortune, who'd been invited to speak at Davos 3 years running. He saw a black woman in a hoodie with a battered bag, looking like she'd just finished a shift at a warehouse. His privileged brain, trained by decades of assuming that appearance equals worth, made the calculation that would destroy his life. Richard cleared his throat, not politely, but the way one might address a servant who'd forgotten their place. "Excuse me." Amara opened both eyes. She didn't move from her relaxed position, didn't smile, didn't show any deference. She simply looked at him with the calm assessment of someone who'd dealt with his type countless times before. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and clear. The storm outside intensified, lightning illuminating the cabin in stark flashes. The Phoenix rocked slightly in the wind, and Captain Miguel Santos's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some weather delays. We'll be holding here for approximately 15 more minutes until the storm passes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." But the real storm was just beginning in Seat 1A, where prejudice and power were about to collide with consequences that would echo far beyond the confines of the aircraft. Richard looked at his boarding pass one more time, his face settling into an expression of supreme entitlement. He was about to make the most expensive assumption of his life. "You're in my seat," Richard stated, not asked. His voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Amara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took another sip of her Macallan and studied the man standing over her. She'd seen his type 1,000 times, the kind of man who thought volume equaled intelligence, who confused aggression with leadership, who'd never learned the difference between respect and fear. To understand this moment, you need to understand the woman Richard Blackwood had just challenged. Amara Davis hadn't always been the calm, controlled CEO sitting in Seat 1A. Her journey to power had been forged in moments exactly like this one, shaped by humiliations that had either broken her or made her unbreakable. 14 years earlier, at age 28, Amara had stepped off a red-eye flight from Los Angeles, exhausted from a 3-day negotiation to secure her first major logistics contract. She'd been wearing sweats and carrying a backpack, looking like any other tired traveler. But she'd just closed a deal that would launch her company into the major leagues. She'd booked a suite at the Charleston Grand Hotel, one of the most prestigious establishments in South Carolina. Her reservation was confirmed, her credit card was platinum, and she'd earned the right to luxury. But when she approached the front desk, the manager took one look at her young black, casually dressed, and made an assumption that would change the trajectory of her entire life. "I'm sorry," the manager had said, not looking sorry at all. "But I don't think you understand the caliber of establishment this is. You might be more comfortable at one of the budget chains off the interstate." Amara had shown her confirmation. She'd produced her credit card. She'd spoken calmly and professionally. But the manager had simply shaken his head. "Our system is down. You'll need to come back when we can verify your reservation with the general manager." The general manager, of course, wouldn't be available until the next morning. That night, Amara had slept in her rental car in the hotel parking lot, watching wealthy white guests walk in and out of the lobby she'd been denied access to. She'd sat there in the humid Charleston darkness, surrounded by luxury she'd earned, but been refused, and made herself a promise. Never again would anyone be able to mistake her for anything less than the owner of the building. The next morning, she'd driven to the hotel's corporate headquarters and made an offer to purchase the entire chain. It took her 3 years to raise the capital and 7 years to complete the acquisition, but she'd kept her promise. The Charleston Grand Hotel was now the flagship property of Carter Hospitality Group, a subsidiary of her logistics empire. The manager who'd turned her away. He'd been terminated the day she signed the purchase agreement. Not out of revenge, but because someone who made judgments based on appearance rather than credentials had no place in her organization. That experience had taught Amara 3 crucial lessons. First, appearance is the most unreliable indicator of worth. Second, the most powerful response to prejudice isn't anger, it's success. And third, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Now sitting in Seat 1A of her own aircraft, watching Richard Blackwood display the same entitled assumptions that had shaped her worldview, Amara felt the familiar calm that came with absolute confidence. She knew exactly how this would play out because she'd lived this movie before. The only difference was that this time she held all the cards from the beginning. Richard Blackwood, meanwhile, was operating from a completely different playbook. The son of a Connecticut investment banker and the grandson of a railroad baron, Richard had been born on third base and spent his entire life convinced he'd hit a triple. He'd attended prep schools where diversity meant having students from both New York and Boston and Ivy League universities where legacy admissions had greased his path to mediocrity. At Pinnacle Capital, Richard specialized in what he called aggressive wealth optimization, a euphemism for investment strategies that maximized profits while minimizing legal liability. His current crisis stemmed from a pension fund investment scheme that had generated massive returns for Pinnacle's clients while leaving retiree accounts dangerously underfunded. The FBI had started asking questions 6 months ago, and Richard's entire career now depended on reaching San Francisco for an emergency meeting with Chinese investors who might provide enough capital to cover the shortfall. But Richard Blackwood had a fatal flaw that made him dangerous in situations like this. He'd never learned to back down. His entire identity was built on dominance, on being the loudest voice in every room, on never accepting no for an answer. In boardrooms, this trait made him effective. On a private aircraft, dealing with a woman he'd fundamentally misread, it was about to destroy everything he'd built. Sophia Blackwood watched her husband square off against the woman in 1A with a growing sense of dread. After 8 years of marriage, she recognized the signs, the rigid posture, the slightly raised voice, the complete inability to consider that he might be wrong. She'd seen him bulldoze through countless situations with sheer force of personality, leaving wreckage in his wake that she'd learned to clean up quietly. But this felt different. The woman in the hoodie hadn't shown fear, hadn't apologized, hadn't offered to move. Instead, she'd looked at Richard with the kind of calm assessment that suggested she was several moves ahead in a game he didn't even know he was playing. Sophia had grown up poor in Miami, the daughter of Cuban immigrants who'd worked double shifts to give her opportunities they'd never had. She'd been beautiful and smart, but beauty had proven to be a more marketable asset in Richard's world. Their marriage had been a transaction disguised as romance, her youth and looks for his money and status. But 8 years of watching him treat service workers, assistants, and anyone he perceived as beneath him had slowly eroded whatever affection she'd once felt. Now she sat in seat 3B, holding her Pomeranian, and watching her husband march toward what felt like a cliff. She'd learned long ago not to intervene. Richard didn't tolerate contradiction from anyone, especially not from his wife. Meanwhile, Jake Morrison and Emma Torres were beginning to sense the drama unfolding in the forward cabin. Jake had built his TikTok following by documenting the absurd behavior of wealthy people in their natural habitats, and his content creator instincts were starting to tingle. He discreetly adjusted his phone's position to capture the interaction between Richard and the woman in 1A. Emma, with her venture capitalist's eye for reading room dynamics, had already noticed something off about the situation. The flight attendant had addressed the woman in 1A as Ms. Davis with a level of familiarity that suggested regular interaction. That kind of relationship didn't happen with random charter passengers. It spoke to someone with serious, frequent flyer status on this particular aircraft. Captain Miguel Santos, monitoring the situation through the cabin intercom system, had heard Richard's initial challenge and felt his experienced pilot's instincts kick in. In 30 years of flying private jets, he'd seen entitled passengers create security situations before. The key was to de-escalate quickly before things got out of hand. But Isabella Rodriguez, who knew exactly who owned the Phoenix, was watching the drama unfold with fascination rather than concern. She'd flown with Amara Davis for 3 years, had seen her handle hostile board meetings, aggressive competitors, and international crises with the same unflappable calm she was displaying now. Isabella knew that Richard Blackwood had just picked a fight with the wrong person, and she was curious to see how Amara would handle it. The storm outside continued to rage, lightning illuminating the cabin in periodic flashes that created an almost theatrical atmosphere. The Phoenix rocked gently in the wind, But the real turbulence was building inside the aircraft, where prejudice and privilege were about to collide with consequences that would reshape multiple lives. Richard looked at his boarding pass one more time, then back at Amara. His face was settling into the expression of supreme entitlement that had served him well in boardrooms, but was about to fail him catastrophically in seat 1A. "I paid $15,000 for priority seating," he said, his voice rising slightly. "This is clearly a mistake." Amara set down her crystal tumbler with deliberate care. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "There are 13 other seats on this aircraft," she said, not moving from her relaxed position. "I'm sure you'll find one of them suitable." The battle lines had been drawn. In the coming minutes, Richard Blackwood would have multiple opportunities to retreat, to apologize, to recognize that he'd misjudged the situation. But his psychology wouldn't allow retreat. It never had. And Amara Davis, who'd spent 14 years building an empire specifically so she'd never again be dismissed or displaced, was about to remind everyone on board what real power looked like. The next exchange would be recorded on multiple devices viewed by millions of people and analyzed in business schools for decades to come. But in that moment, in the luxurious cabin of the Phoenix, it was simply two people with radically different understandings of who controlled the situation. Richard Blackwood thought he was dealing with an uppity passenger who needed to be put in her place. Amara Davis knew she was about to educate a privileged bully about the difference between noise and power. The storm was about to pass outside. But inside the Phoenix, the real tempest was just beginning. "Listen, sweetheart," Richard said, the condescending endearment dripping from his lips like poison. "Maybe the cleaning crew gets a break before takeoff, but I need this seat for business. I've got calls to make, deals to close, real work to do." The word sweetheart hung in the air like a slap. Every person in the cabin felt the insult land. Sophia's face flushed with embarrassment. Jake's finger moved instinctively to his phone's record button. Emma straightened in her seat, recognizing the moment when casual rudeness crossed into something much uglier. But Amara Davis didn't flinch. She'd heard worse from better men than Richard Blackwood. Instead, she looked at him with the kind of calm that comes from absolute confidence and spoke in a voice that was soft but carried the unmistakable weight of authority. "You really don't want to do this, Richard." The use of his name stopped him cold for a moment. How did she know who he was? But Richard's psychology didn't allow for careful consideration. He'd built his entire identity on dominating every interaction, on never backing down, on being the biggest personality in every room. The possibility that he'd misjudged the situation was literally unthinkable. "Oh, I really do," he sneered, taking a step closer and invading her personal space. "I don't know what kind of scam you're running or who you think you are, but this is my seat. I paid for it. I reserved it, and I'm not negotiating with someone who probably snuck on board during the cleaning." The racist implications hit the cabin like a physical force. Sophia's hands flew to her mouth in horror. Jake's TikTok instincts kicked into overdrive as he started recording, immediately sensing that he was capturing something that would break the internet. Emma pulled out her phone and opened Instagram Live, her venture capitalist's sense for historic moments, telling her this was about to become very, very big. Isabella Rodriguez, watching from the galley, felt her professional training war with her personal loyalty to Amara. She stepped forward, her voice professionally calm but with steel underneath. "Sir, I need to ask you to return to your assigned seat. Ms. Davis's reservation is—" "I don't care about her reservation." Richard cut her off, his voice rising to a volume that seemed designed to intimidate. "I'm not taking orders from the help, and I'm not giving up my seat to some welfare queen who probably used food stamps to buy her ticket." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the storm outside seemed to pause. Jake's live stream, which had started with maybe 50 viewers, suddenly exploded to over 10,000 as viewers shared the footage in real time. Emma's Instagram story was being screenshotted and forwarded across every social platform. But most importantly, Captain Miguel Santos, monitoring the cabin through the intercom system, had heard every word. In 30 years of aviation, he'd dealt with drunk passengers, belligerent celebrities, and entitled billionaires, but he'd rarely heard such blatant racial hostility. His finger moved to the cockpit controls that would formally log a security incident. Amara stood up slowly. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with the deliberate movement of someone who'd made a decision. At 5 feet 8 inches, she was nearly Richard's height, and when she looked directly into his eyes, he saw something there that his privileged brain couldn't process: absolute fearlessness. That she said, her voice still soft, but now carrying the promise of consequences, is the most expensive sentence you'll ever speak. Richard laughed a harsh, ugly sound. Expensive, lady. You don't know expensive. I'm worth $50 million. I own properties in the Hamptons, Aspen, and Monaco. I drive a Bugatti that costs more than most people's houses. You think I'm worried about some ghetto princess who... He never finished the sentence. Because that's when Amara Davis pulled out her phone and made one simple call that would change his life forever. Marcus, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. Initiate Protocol 7. The response came through her phone's speaker, audible to everyone nearby. Yes, ma'am. The Phoenix incident file. Affirmative. Everything's being recorded. The usual federal charges apply: interference with flight crew harassment assault. Oh, and Marcus add civil suits for defamation and business interference. Full prosecution. Understood, Ms. Davis. Legal team is en route to the airport. Should I contact the FBI field office directly? Let's start with airport security. Federal agents can sort it out from there. Richard's face had gone pale. Who are you calling? You can't just... But Amara wasn't finished. She pressed another contact on her phone. Isabella, would you please ask Captain Santos to contact ground control? We have a security situation that needs to be resolved before we can depart. The professional deference in Isabella's voice was unmistakable. Of course, Ms. Davis. Right away. That's when the pieces started clicking into place for everyone in the cabin. The flight attendant's familiarity. The effortless authority. The phone call to someone called Marcus, who spoke to her like she was in charge of something very, very important. Jake's TikTok stream had exploded to 50,000 live viewers' comments flooding in faster than he could read them. Emma's Instagram followers were tagging major news outlets, entertainment blogs, and social justice advocates. The story was already going viral, spreading across platforms faster than either content creator could track. Richard, meanwhile, was experiencing the first cracks in his absolute certainty. Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. I'm sure we can work something out. No, Amara said simply. We can't. That's when Captain Santos emerged from the cockpit. At 55, Miguel Santos was a veteran pilot who'd flown heads of state, tech billionaires, and Hollywood royalty. He'd seen every kind of passenger behavior imaginable, but he'd never had to deal with overt racial harassment on his aircraft. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone used to managing crises at 40,000 feet. We have a security situation that requires ground resolution before we can depart. Ground control has been notified, and airport security is en route. Richard spun to face him. Security? Are you insane? I'm the victim here. This woman is squatting in my seat, and when I tried to handle it politely, she started threatening me with lawyers. Captain Santos had been monitoring the cabin conversation through the intercom. He'd heard every word of Richard's racist tirade, and his professional assessment was crystal clear. Sir, you've been verbally abusive toward a passenger and flight crew. You've made racially hostile comments that were recorded by multiple devices, and you've created a disruption that endangers flight safety. Under federal aviation regulations, you're now classified as a security threat. Sophia Blackwood finally found her voice. Richard, stop! Please, just Stop talking and sit down." But Richard's psychology wouldn't allow retreat. Backing down had never been part of his playbook, and he genuinely couldn't process that he was the one in the wrong. "I want to speak to the owner of this aircraft," he demanded. "I want to talk to whoever's in charge of this charter company. This is discrimination against a paying customer, and I guarantee you I'll sue for everything you're worth." The irony was so perfect that even Amara had to suppress a smile. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and nodded to Isabella. "That would be my head of legal," she said to Richard. "Would you like to speak with him?" She answered the call and put it on speaker. "Marcus, you're live in the cabin." The voice that came through the phone was crisp, professional, and carried the authority of someone who'd handled major corporate crises. "Good evening. This is Marcus Rivera, General Counsel for Vanguard Logistics." "To whom am I speaking?" Richard, sensing an opportunity to appeal to someone in authority, stepped forward. "This is Richard Blackwood, Managing Partner at Pinnacle Capital. Your passenger is squatting in my assigned seat, and when I tried to resolve it professionally, she started making legal threats." "I demand, Mr. Blackwood," Marcus interrupted smoothly, "I need to inform you that you're currently trespassing on a private aircraft owned by Vanguard Logistics. The passenger you've been harassing is Amara Davis, CEO of Vanguard Logistics and owner of the aircraft you're standing in." The cabin fell silent except for the sound of the storm outside. Richard's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, and then dawning horror as the implications hit him. That's impossible," he stammered. She doesn't look like what Mr. Blackwood." Marcus's voice was dangerously quiet. "Please finish that thought for our recording." But Richard had finally belatedly realized the magnitude of his mistake. The woman he'd spent 10 minutes racially abusing, the person he'd called a welfare queen, and accused of using food stamps, the human being he'd tried to physically intimidate and displace from her seat, she owned the aircraft. Jake's TikTok stream had reached 100,000 live viewers. Emma's Instagram story was being shared by major news outlets. The story was exploding across every social platform simultaneously, and Richard Blackwood was at the center of it all. I didn't know," he whispered. Amara stood up fully now, her presence suddenly filling the cabin. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd built an empire from nothing and wasn't impressed by Richard's $50 million or his list of properties. "You didn't know because you didn't ask," she said. "You saw a black woman in casual clothes and assumed she didn't belong in first class. You made judgments based on skin color rather than investigating facts. And when your assumptions were challenged, you doubled down with racist insults rather than considering you might be wrong." The psychology lesson was devastating in its accuracy. Sophia was crying quietly in her seat, watching her husband's career implode in real time. Jake and Emma were documenting every moment for their millions of combined followers. Isabella was preparing the legal documentation that would accompany the federal charges, and outside, through the storm and lightning, airport security vehicles were approaching the Phoenix with flashing lights. Richard Blackwood had started the evening as a wealthy, powerful hedge fund manager, flying to a meeting that would save his company. He was about to end it in handcuffs, facing federal charges with his racist tirade viewed by millions of people around the world, all because he couldn't imagine that a black woman in a hoodie might own the airplane he was standing in. The flashing lights of airport security vehicles painted the cabin in alternating red and blue as they approached through the storm. Richard Blackwood stood frozen in the aisle, his $50 million net worth suddenly feeling worthless against the reality closing in around him. Mr. Blackwood, Marcus Rivera's voice continued through Amara's phone speaker. "Airport security is boarding now to escort you off the aircraft. You'll be processed for federal charges including interference with a flight crew, harassment, and assault. Additionally, Ms. Davis will be filing civil suits for defamation, business interference, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Assault. Richard's voice cracked. I never touched her. You invaded her personal space in a threatening manner, grabbed her luggage, and made physically intimidating gestures while hurling racial slurs. Marcus replied with the precision of someone who'd reviewed the footage. Under federal law, that constitutes assault. The fact that it occurred on an aircraft makes it a federal crime with mandatory minimum sentencing. The cabin door opened and 3 airport security officers entered, followed by 2 federal air marshals in plain clothes. The lead officer, a woman in her 40s with the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen everything, surveyed the scene quickly. I'm Officer Patricia Williams, Port Authority Police, she announced. We received reports of a passenger disturbance involving racial harassment and threats. Who's the complainant? Amara stepped forward. I'm Amara Davis, owner of this aircraft. This passenger, she indicated Richard, has spent the last 15 minutes subjecting me to racist abuse while attempting to force me from my seat. Officer Williams looked at Richard, taking in his expensive suit and obvious wealth, then at Amara in her casual clothes. But 20 years in airport security had taught her that appearances were the least reliable indicator of who was telling the truth. Sir, I'm going to need you to step off the aircraft for questioning, she told Richard. This is insane. Richard exploded. I'm being railroaded here. I made a simple mistake about seat assignments and now everyone's acting like I committed a hate crime. That's when Jake Morrison, still live streaming to his now 200,000 viewers, spoke up. Officer, I recorded the entire interaction. Would you like to see the footage? Within minutes, Officer Williams was watching Richard's racist tirade play out on Jake's phone screen. The audio was crystal clear. Welfare Queen food stamps, back where you belong, ghetto princess. Every slur, every assumption, every moment of escalating hostility captured in high-definition video. Mr. Blackwood, Officer Williams said after viewing the footage, you're under arrest for interference with aircraft operations, harassment, and making terrorist threats. Terrorist threats. Richard's voice was approaching hysteria. I never made any terrorist threats. Under federal law, any threat made on an aircraft that causes fear or disruption to passengers or crew constitutes a terrorist threat, one of the air marshals explained as he produced handcuffs. Your behavior has created a security situation that grounded this flight and required emergency response. As the handcuffs clicked around Richard's wrists, Sophia finally stood up from her seat. She walked to where her husband was being processed, her face a mask of carefully controlled emotion. Richard, she said quietly, I'm filing for divorce. Tonight. The words hit him harder than the arrest. Sophia, baby, don't do this now. This is just a misunderstanding. Once my lawyers... Your lawyers won't help you, she interrupted. I've already called mine. I'm also cooperating with the FBI investigation into the pension fund irregularities. Richard's face went ashen. The pension fund investigation had been his most carefully guarded secret, the crisis he'd been flying to San Francisco to resolve. Sophia's cooperation with federal investigators would provide them with access to personal financial records, private conversations, and insider knowledge that could destroy him completely. You can't do this, he whispered. You signed a prenup. You can't take anything. Sophia smiled sadly. The prenup becomes void if you're convicted of federal crimes. My lawyers explained that yesterday when I met with them. As Richard was led off the aircraft in handcuffs, Officer Williams turned to address the remaining passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your cooperation. The aircraft is cleared for departure once the captain completes his security checklist. But the real drama was just beginning. Jake's TikTok stream had exploded across social media, with clips being shared faster than platforms could track them. Emma's Instagram story was being picked up by news outlets in real time. The hashtag #PrivateJetRacist was trending on Twitter, and Richard Blackwood's name was about to become synonymous with entitled bigotry. As the storm finally began to clear outside, Amara returned to her seat and picked up her crystal tumbler. Isabella approached with the bottle of Macallan. "Another, Miss Davis. Please." Amara's voice was steady, but she felt the exhaustion of the confrontation settling in. "And, Isabella, thank you for maintaining professionalism through all of that." Isabella smiled. "In 3 years of flying with you, that's the first time I've seen someone challenge your seat assignment. I was curious how you'd handle it." Captain Santos's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for immediate departure. Flight time to San Francisco will be approximately 5 hours. We apologize for the delay." As the Phoenix taxied toward the runway, Jake and Emma were documenting the aftermath for their followers. Jake's TikTok had reached 500,000 views and was climbing exponentially. Emma's Instagram story was being shared by celebrities, politicians, and social justice advocates. But the real explosion was happening online, where the footage was spreading like wildfire across every platform simultaneously. Within an hour, Richard Blackwood's racist tirade would be viewed by millions of people. His name would trend worldwide. His company would receive thousands of angry emails and phone calls. And in a federal holding cell at Westchester County Airport, Richard would watch his entire life crumble in real time on the jail's television as news outlets picked up the story. As the Phoenix lifted off into the stormy night sky, Amara looked out at the lightning illuminating the clouds and reflected on the evening's events. She'd spent 14 years building an empire specifically so she'd never again be dismissed or displaced because of her appearance. Tonight, she'd proven that the power she'd built worked exactly as designed. Richard Blackwood had assumed that noise equaled power, that volume meant authority, that his privilege gave him the right to dismiss anyone he deemed unworthy. He'd been wrong about all of it. Power, real power, didn't announce itself with racist tirades or expensive suits. It whispered with absolute confidence and backed up its words with consequences. Tonight, Richard had learned the difference between wealth and power, between noise and authority, between privilege and justice. And as the Phoenix soared through the storm toward San Francisco, millions of people around the world were learning the same lesson through their screens, watching the footage of a man who'd confused his bank account with his character and paid the ultimate price for that mistake. The seat in 1A remained occupied by its rightful owner. But the story of what happened there would resonate far beyond the confines of any aircraft, becoming a defining moment in how society talked about privilege, prejudice, and the power of standing your ground when someone tries to move you. The moment the Phoenix's wheels left the runway, Richard Blackwood's world began to implode at the speed of light. In the digital age, careers can be destroyed faster than they can be built, and Richard was about to learn this lesson in the most public way possible. Jake Morrison's TikTok video had exploded beyond all expectations. What started as casual private jet content for his 100,000 followers had become a viral phenomenon reaching millions within the first hour. The algorithm had identified the content as explosive racism, wealth, private jets, and justice all wrapped into a perfect social media storm and pushed it to every corner of the platform. Emma Torres, with her venture capitalist's instinct for market movements, had immediately cross-posted clips to Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Her commentary was clinical and devastating. "This is what racism looks like when the cameras are rolling. Imagine what happens when they're not." As the Phoenix cruised toward San Francisco at 42,000 feet, the footage was being shared, analyzed, and dissected by millions of viewers. The hashtags #PrivateJet, racist, #Amara Davis, and #Richard Blackwood were all trending simultaneously across multiple platforms. In the cabin, Amara had finally relaxed back into her seat, the Macallan working its magic as the adrenaline from the confrontation began to fade. Isabella brought her a small plate of the artisanal chocolates she preferred, while Captain Santos provided updates on their smooth flight path to San Francisco. "Ms. Davis," Isabella said quietly, "I've been flying corporate jets for 12 years and I've never seen anything quite like that. The way you handled it, that was masterful." Amara smiled wearily. I've had a lot of practice dealing with men like Richard Blackwood. The only difference tonight was that he picked the wrong airplane to have his breakdown on. Meanwhile, Jake and Emma were documenting the aftermath for their followers, providing real-time commentary on the social media explosion they'd helped create. Jake's analytics showed the video had reached 2.3 million views and was climbing exponentially. Emma's LinkedIn post about racism in corporate America was being shared by executives, diversity professionals, and business school professors. But the real drama was unfolding on the ground, where Richard Blackwood was experiencing the fastest professional collapse in hedge fund history. At Pinnacle Capital's Manhattan headquarters, the emergency board meeting had been called within 30 minutes of the video going viral. The footage was playing on loop on every major news channel, and the firm's phones were ringing non-stop with angry investors, disgusted clients, and hostile media requests. "We have to move fast," announced Patricia Morse, the firm's lead counsel. "The video is authentic, the audio is clear, and it's already been viewed by over 3 million people. We have maybe an hour before this becomes completely uncontainable." Board member Jonathan Hayes was frantically scrolling through Twitter on his phone. "It's already uncontainable. The hashtag is trending in 12 countries. The New York Times just posted a breaking news alert. CNN is running the story as their lead. But the most damaging development was happening in the firm's institutional client base. Pinnacle Capital managed money for pension funds, university endowments, and charitable foundations organizations with zero tolerance for public racism scandals. Within 2 hours of the video going viral, withdrawal notices were flooding the firm's client services department. The first major domino fell at 10:47 p.m. Eastern Time when the California Teachers Retirement Fund, Pinnacle's largest client with $2.8 billion under management, issued a public statement. Cal STRS has zero tolerance for racism and discrimination. We are immediately terminating our relationship with Pinnacle Capital and withdrawing all assets under management. Other institutional clients followed within minutes. The University of Michigan Endowment, the Ford Foundation, the City of Seattle Pension Fund, all announced immediate withdrawals accompanied by strongly worded statements condemning Richard's behavior. By 11 p.m., Pinnacle Capital had lost $8.7 billion in assets under management. The firm's survival was no longer a question of managing the scandal, it was a question of whether they could prevent complete financial collapse. The board's emergency vote was unanimous. Richard Blackwood is hereby terminated for cause effective immediately. All access to firm offices and client relationships is revoked. Pinnacle Capital disavows his statements and actions completely. But Richard's problems extended far beyond his professional destruction. In his federal holding cell, he was about to learn that his legal situation was even worse than his career prospects. Federal prosecutor Amanda Lopez had been awakened at her Georgetown home by the FBI duty officer. The Bureau's Domestic Terrorism Unit had flagged the incident as a potential hate crime committed on federal property, and the viral nature of the evidence meant the case would receive maximum public attention. "The video evidence is overwhelming," Lopez told her team during an emergency conference call. "We have clear documentation of racial harassment, interference with aircraft operations, and threatening behavior toward flight crew. Under federal sentencing guidelines, he's looking at 2 to 5 years minimum. But the FBI investigation was about to uncover much more serious crimes. When agents executed a search warrant on Richard's offices and residences, they found evidence of the pension fund irregularities that Sophia had mentioned. What they discovered was a $200 million embezzlement scheme that had been ongoing for 3 years. "It's worse than we thought," Special Agent Maria Rodriguez told her supervisor. "This wasn't just skimming fees. He was stealing directly from retiree accounts and using the money to cover trading losses. We're talking about elderly teachers and firefighters who've lost their life savings." The pension fund fraud elevated Richard's case from a simple assault and harassment charge to a major federal racketeering investigation. The combination of the viral racist incident and the financial crimes created a perfect storm that would dominate news cycles for weeks. Meanwhile, on social media, the story was taking on a life of its own. The video had spawned countless reaction videos, memes, and commentary pieces. Late-night talk show hosts were already writing jokes about the incident. Political commentators were using it as evidence of broader social problems. But the most powerful responses were coming from ordinary people sharing their own stories of discrimination. The hashtag #MyOwnSeat began trending as thousands of users shared experiences of being questioned, challenged, or dismissed because of their appearance in spaces they had every right to occupy. Amara, monitoring the social media explosion from her laptop at 42,000 feet, was struck by the personal nature of many responses. Her viral moment had become a catalyst for a much broader conversation about dignity, respect, and the assumptions people make based on appearance. "Look at this." She showed Isabella a tweet that had been shared 50,000 times. "I'm a neurosurgeon, but I've been asked to move from first-class seats 12 times because people assumed I was flying on someone else's ticket. Thank you, Amara Davis, for showing us what dignity looks like." The economic consequences for Richard were accelerating beyond his professional life. By midnight, his personal wealth was under federal seizure as part of the fraud investigation. His Hamptons estate, his Monaco apartment, his collection of luxury cars, all frozen pending criminal proceedings. Sophia, meanwhile, was experiencing liberation she hadn't felt in 8 years. Her divorce attorney had filed emergency papers citing domestic emotional abuse and financial fraud, while her cooperation with federal investigators guaranteed her immunity from prosecution. "Mrs. Blackwood," her attorney explained, "your husband's prenuptial agreement becomes void due to his criminal behavior. You're entitled to half of any legitimate assets plus additional compensation for emotional distress. You're also protected by whistleblower statutes for your cooperation with federal authorities." As the Phoenix began its descent toward San Francisco International Airport, the full scope of Richard's destruction was becoming clear. His career was over, his wealth was seized, his marriage was dissolved, and he was facing federal charges that could result in decades in prison. But perhaps the most devastating consequence was the complete demolition of his reputation. Richard Blackwood had become a global symbol of entitled racism, his name forever associated with the viral video that showed him at his absolute worst. The story had transcended the original incident, becoming a case study in how quickly privilege could crumble when exposed to the light of public scrutiny. Business schools would analyze it as an example of crisis management failure. Diversity consultants would use it to illustrate the costs of workplace discrimination. Legal scholars would cite it in discussions of federal hate crime prosecutions. As Amara prepared for landing, she reflected on the evening's events with mixed emotions. She'd never intended to destroy Richard Blackwood's life, she'd simply stood her ground when challenged. But his escalating racism and refusal to back down had created a situation where consequences became inevitable. The Phoenix touched down smoothly at SFO, where news crews were already waiting. Word of the incident had reached the West Coast, and Amara's arrival would be the next chapter in a story that was reshaping national conversations about race, privilege, and accountability. Richard Blackwood had started the evening as a wealthy hedge fund manager flying to save his company. He would end it as a federal defendant facing decades in prison, his racist tirade viewed by tens of millions of people around the world. All because he couldn't imagine that a black woman in a hoodie might own the airplane seat she was sitting in. The wheels of justice, unlike commercial aircraft, don't always run on schedule. But in the case of United States versus Richard Blackwood, the federal prosecution moved with unprecedented speed, driven by overwhelming evidence and massive public interest. Federal prosecutor Amanda Lopez had rarely seen a case with such clear documentation. The TikTok and Instagram footage provided 4K video evidence of every racial slur, every threatening gesture, and every moment of escalation. Unlike most discrimination cases, which often devolved into he said, she said arguments, This case offered crystal-clear proof of federal crimes committed in front of multiple witnesses and recorded from multiple angles. "It's a prosecutor's dream case," Lopez told her team during the preparation phase. "We have video, audio, multiple witness testimonies, and federal jurisdiction due to the aircraft location." The defendant essentially prosecuted himself by refusing to stop talking. But the case expanded dramatically when FBI forensic accountants completed their analysis of Pinnacle Capital's financial records. What they discovered was a labyrinth of financial fraud that dwarfed the airplane incident in scope and criminality. Richard had been operating a sophisticated embezzlement scheme for over 3 years, taking money from pension funds that represented the retirement savings of teachers, firefighters, and municipal workers across 6 states. The stolen money had been used to cover massive trading losses that Richard had hidden from investors and regulators. The total theft appears to exceed $200 million, Special Agent Maria Rodriguez reported to Lopez. "We've identified at least 37 separate instances of wire fraud, money laundering, and securities violations. Some retirees have lost their entire life savings. The combination of the hate crime charges and the financial fraud created a prosecutorial powerhouse that would make Richard Blackwood's case one of the most significant white-collar criminal trials of the decade." Meanwhile, the civil litigation was moving forward with equal force. Marcus Rivera. Amara's general counsel had assembled a team of the nation's top civil rights attorneys to pursue damages for harassment, defamation, and business interference. "Our client suffered public humiliation, racist abuse, and threats to her personal safety," Rivera explained to reporters outside the federal courthouse. Mr. Blackwood's behavior was captured on video and viewed by millions of people worldwide. The damage to Ms. Davis's reputation and peace of mind is incalculable. The civil case was particularly strong because Richard's racist statements had been made publicly recorded clearly and distributed widely. Defamation law heavily favored Amara when the defendant had literally called her a welfare queen and suggested she'd used food stamps to buy her ticket statements that were both false and damaging to her reputation as a successful CEO. But the legal proceedings were only part of a much larger cultural reckoning that the incident had triggered. The video had become a defining moment in national conversations about racism, privilege, and accountability. Dr. Jennifer Washington, a professor of sociology at Stanford University, was studying the incident's social media impact for a research paper on viral justice. "What makes this case unique is the intersection of race, class, and technology," she explained in an interview with NPR. "We see a wealthy white man making assumptions based purely on appearance, then having those assumptions demolished in real time by social media. The hashtag #MyOwnSeat had generated over 2 million posts from people sharing their own experiences with discrimination in airports, hotels, restaurants, and other public spaces. The stories were heartbreaking in their similarity. Accomplished professionals, successful entrepreneurs, and distinguished citizens, all challenged or dismissed because their appearance didn't match expectations." Amara found herself reluctantly thrust into the role of spokesperson for a movement she'd never intended to start. Her appearances on news programs were watched by millions. Her interviews were dissected and analyzed, and her calm, dignified responses to hostile questions became viral content in their own right. "I want to be clear about something," she said during a CNN interview with Anderson Cooper. "I never set out to become a symbol of anything. I was simply a tired businesswoman trying to get home after a difficult week. The fact that standing my ground became a viral moment says more about our society's problems than it does about my actions." Cooper pressed her on the broader implications. "Do you think this incident has changed anything meaningful about how we discuss race and privilege in America?" Amara paused, considering her words carefully. "I think it's provided a clear example of how unconscious bias operates. Richard Blackwood isn't uniquely evil. He's a product of a society that taught him to make assumptions based on appearance rather than evidence. The real question is whether institutions will learn from this and implement meaningful changes. Those institutional changes were already beginning to happen. United Airlines announced new training protocols for all flight staff focused on recognizing and preventing discriminatory behavior. Marriott Hotels implemented similar programs for front desk personnel. The Association of Corporate Flight Attendants developed new standards specifically addressing passenger dignity and bias prevention. But the most significant changes were happening in corporate boardrooms, where the Richard Blackwood case had become a cautionary tale about the speed with which racism scandals could destroy companies and careers. Every CEO in America has watched that video, explained crisis management consultant David Park. They've seen how quickly a moment of poor judgment can become a global scandal. It's changed how companies think about risk management and employee training. The business school case studies were already being written. Harvard Business School announced a new course examining the intersection of social media, corporate reputation, and crisis management, using the Blackwood incident as a primary example. Meanwhile, Richard himself was discovering the personal costs of his viral infamy. In federal custody awaiting trial, he'd been placed in protective isolation due to threats from other inmates who'd seen the footage. His racist tirade had made him a target for violence in a prison that didn't tolerate public displays of racial hostility. His legal team, led by prominent white-collar defense attorney Sarah Mitchell, was struggling with an almost impossible case. The video evidence was overwhelming. The financial fraud was extensively documented, and their client had essentially confessed to multiple federal crimes while being recorded. The challenge isn't proving innocence, Mitchell explained to her team. The evidence is overwhelming. Our only option is damage control and hoping for a plea agreement that doesn't result in life imprisonment. But federal prosecutors weren't inclined toward leniency. The case had become too high profile, the evidence too clear, and the public interest too intense for lenient plea bargaining. The financial investigation had also revealed additional victims beyond the pension fund investors. Richard's hedge fund had been operating a Ponzi scheme that had defrauded individual investors out of millions of dollars. Elderly couples who'd trusted their retirement savings to Pinnacle Capital discovered that their money had been stolen to cover Richard's trading losses. We've identified over 200 individual victims, Prosecutor Lopez announced at a press conference. These are teachers, nurses, firefighters, and retirees who trusted Mr. Blackwood with their life savings. The scope of his betrayal extends far beyond the racist incident on the airplane. The victim impact statements were devastating. Mary Peterson, a 68-year-old retired teacher from Ohio, had lost $300,000, her entire retirement savings, to Richard's fraud. I worked 42 years to save that money, she said through tears at a press conference. I was planning to leave something for my grandchildren. Now I'm working part-time at a grocery store just to pay rent. Stories like Peterson's multiplied across news coverage, adding a deeply personal dimension to what might otherwise have been viewed as a white-collar crime involving abstract financial instruments. Richard hadn't just stolen money, he'd destroyed the retirement security of hundreds of hard-working Americans. The social media response to these revelations was explosive. The hashtag #Justice for Mary Peterson began trending as users shared stories of elderly relatives affected by financial fraud. The combination of racist behavior and theft from retirees created a perfect storm of public outrage. Sophia Blackwood, meanwhile, was experiencing a very different kind of viral moment. Her decision to divorce Richard and cooperate with federal investigators had made her a folk hero among women who'd escaped abusive relationships. Her television interviews, where she spoke candidly about 8 years of emotional manipulation and financial control, resonated with millions of viewers. I want other women to understand that leaving isn't always easy, she said during an appearance on The View. Richard controlled every aspect of my life, my money, my friends, my decisions. It took watching him destroy himself on that airplane for me to realize I could have a different life. Her cooperation with investigators was providing crucial evidence for the prosecution. as Richard's wife, Sophia, had access to personal financial records, private conversations, and insider knowledge that helped federal agents trace the full scope of his criminal enterprise. The trial date was set for 6 months after the incident, but legal experts predicted Richard would accept a plea agreement rather than face a jury that had seen his racist tirade replayed countless times on television and social media. No defense attorney wants to put a client in front of a jury when there's 4K video evidence of him making racist statements, explained legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin during a CNN segment. The airplane footage has made him virtually undefendable in front of any diverse jury. As the legal proceedings continued, Amara was working to channel the attention from the incident into positive change. She'd established the Dignity in Transit Foundation, a nonprofit organization focused on combating discrimination in transportation, hospitality, and public accommodations. The foundation's first initiative was a partnership with major airlines to develop bias recognition training for all customer-facing employees. The program, called the Davis Protocol in honor of Amara's dignified response to Richard's attack, was being implemented by United, Delta, American, and Southwest Airlines. "We want to prevent incidents like this from happening to other travelers," Amara explained during the Foundation's launch event. "No one should be questioned about their right to occupy a seat they've paid for simply because of how they look." The Foundation was also working with hotel chains, car rental companies, and restaurant groups to implement similar training programs. The goal was to create industry-wide standards that would make discrimination both recognizable and unacceptable. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was happening in schools and universities, where the Richard Blackwood incident was being used to teach young people about implicit bias, digital citizenship, and the consequences of discriminatory behavior. "This case provides a perfect teaching moment," explained Dr. Patricia Williams, who taught media literacy at Georgetown University. "Students can see in real time how prejudice operates, how social media amplifies consequences, and how individual actions can become global conversations about justice." The educational applications were extensive. High school social studies classes were analyzing the incident as part of units on civil rights and social justice. Business schools were examining it as a case study in crisis management and corporate responsibility. Law schools were using it to teach students about federal hate crime prosecutions and civil rights litigation. As the 6-month mark approached and Richard's trial date loomed, the broader impact of the incident was becoming clear. One moment of racist behavior captured on video and shared globally had triggered conversations, policy changes, and institutional reforms that would last for decades. Richard Blackwood had thought he was simply claiming a seat on an airplane. Instead, he'd inadvertently sparked a movement that would reshape how American institutions thought about dignity, respect, and accountability. And Amara Davis, who'd simply wanted to fly home after a difficult week, had become an unlikely catalyst for change, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is simply refusing to be moved. 5 years after the incident that made her a global symbol of dignity in the face of racism, Amara Davis returned to Westchester County Airport on another storm-battered evening. The Phoenix sat on the same tarmac where her confrontation with Richard Blackwood had been recorded, shared worldwide, and transformed into a catalyst for institutional change across America. But this wasn't the same woman who'd been racially abused in Seat 1A 5 years earlier. Amara now carried the Congressional Medal for Corporate Courage, had been featured on the cover of Time magazine as one of the world's most influential people, and had spoken at the United Nations about dignity and human rights. Her Dignity in Transit Foundation had become a global organization working to eliminate discrimination in public accommodations worldwide. The changes that had emerged from that viral moment were profound and measurable. The Davis Protocol, initially implemented by 4 airlines, had expanded to become an industry standard adopted by transportation companies across 6 continents. The training program had reached over 2 million employees and was credited with preventing countless incidents of discriminatory behavior. "The numbers don't lie," explained Dr. Jennifer Washington, the Stanford sociologist who'd studied the incident's impact. Formal discrimination complaints in the airline industry have dropped by 73% since the Davis Protocol was implemented. Hotel industry complaints are down 68%. The training programs work because they help employees recognize and interrupt their own bias before it becomes harmful behavior. The Foundation's work had also extended into legislative advocacy. The Passenger Dignity Act, inspired directly by Amara's experience, had passed Congress with bipartisan support and established federal standards for non-discriminatory treatment in all modes of transportation. Similar legislation had been adopted in 12 other countries. But tonight, Amara wasn't flying alone. The Phoenix was carrying a diverse group of young entrepreneurs, women and men of all backgrounds who'd been selected for the Foundation's leadership program. They were flying to San Francisco for the Global Dignity Summit, where they would present their ideas for combating discrimination and promoting inclusion in their communities. Ms. Davis said Keisha Williams, a 26-year-old black woman from Detroit, who'd developed an app to help travelers report discrimination in real time. "I wanted to thank you for showing us that we don't have to accept disrespect. Your example gave me the courage to start my own company." Amara smiled, settling into seat 1A, the same seat where her journey as an advocate had begun. "You found that courage inside yourself, Keisha. I just demonstrated what it looks like when someone refuses to be moved from where they belong." Isabella Rodriguez, now the head of customer experience training for the charter company, approached with Amara's preferred Macallan. After 5 years, Isabella had become much more than a flight attendant. She was a nationally recognized expert on bias prevention and had testified before Congress about discrimination in the aviation industry. The usual Ms. Davis Isabella asked with a warm smile, "Please, and pour glasses for everyone tonight. We're celebrating." As the Phoenix prepared for departure, Captain Miguel Santos, now Director of Diversity Training for the Airline Pilots Association, made an announcement that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Santos. Before we depart, I want to acknowledge that this aircraft is historically significant. 5 years ago, in Seat 1A, Amara Davis demonstrated that dignity is not negotiable and that standing your ground can change the world. Tonight, we're honored to carry the next generation of leaders who will continue that work." The young entrepreneurs applauded, many of them emotional. For them, Amara's story wasn't ancient history, it was the foundation of their own activism and entrepreneurship. They'd grown up watching the viral video, learning from her example, and building on the changes she'd initiated. As the aircraft lifted off into the stormy night, the conversation turned to the long-term impact of that original incident. Jake Morrison, the TikToker whose recording had made the confrontation viral, had transformed his social media platform into a documentary production company focused on social justice stories. His film about the Richard Blackwood incident had won an Academy Award and donated all proceeds to the Dignity in Transit Foundation. Emma Torres had used her venture capital background to create a fund specifically supporting entrepreneurs from underrepresented communities. Her portfolio companies had created thousands of jobs and generated billions in economic value, proving that diversity wasn't just morally right, it was financially smart. But perhaps the most profound changes had happened in corporate boardrooms and executive suites across America. The Richard Blackwood case had become required study for business leaders, demonstrating how quickly racist behavior could destroy careers, companies, and personal wealth. Every CEO in America has seen that video, explained David Park, the crisis management consultant who'd studied the incident's business impact. It fundamentally changed how corporate leaders think about risk. Discriminatory behavior isn't just morally wrong, it's an existential threat to company survival. The business world had internalized the lesson through necessity. In the 5 years since the incident, dozens of executives had been terminated for discriminatory behavior captured on social media. The swift, decisive corporate responses had created a powerful deterrent effect that protected employees and customers from the kind of abuse Amara had endured. Meanwhile, in a minimum security federal prison in Pennsylvania, Richard Blackwood was serving the final year of his 7-year sentence for fraud, money laundering, and civil rights violations. The man who'd once controlled hundreds of millions of dollars now worked in the prison laundry for 75 cents per hour, his appeals exhausted and his reputation permanently destroyed. His racist tirade continued to follow him even behind bars. Guards and inmates who recognized him from the viral video ensured that his incarceration was particularly difficult. The privilege that had once protected him had become a liability in an environment that punished displays of racial hostility. Sophia Blackwood had built an entirely different life. She'd used her divorce settlement to establish a foundation supporting women escaping financial abuse, had remarried a childhood sweetheart who treated her with respect and kindness, and had found peace in a life defined by service rather than status. "Richard's behavior on that airplane was horrible," she said during a recent interview, "but it gave me the courage to leave a marriage that was destroying me." In a strange way, Amara Davis saved my life too. The pension fund victims had been made whole through asset recovery and victim compensation funds, but the emotional impact of Richard's betrayal had lasting effects. Mary Peterson, the retired teacher who'd lost her life savings, had become an advocate for financial literacy education in schools. "I don't want other families to experience what we went through," Peterson explained. "Richard Blackwood stole our money, but the real crime was that we trusted someone who saw us as marks rather than human beings." As the Phoenix approached San Francisco, Amara reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken. She'd built a logistics empire, accumulated enormous wealth, and achieved professional success beyond her wildest dreams. But her lasting legacy would be the movement that had emerged from a moment when she'd simply refused to give up her seat to a racist bully. The Dignity in Transit Foundation now operated in 23 countries, had trained over 3 million employees in bias recognition and prevention, and had helped create legal frameworks for protecting human dignity in public spaces worldwide. The organization's work had expanded beyond transportation to encompass healthcare, education, housing, and employment discrimination. "What strikes me most," Amara told the young entrepreneurs as they prepared for landing, "is that none of this was planned. I wasn't trying to start a movement or become a symbol. I was just a tired businesswoman who refused to accept disrespectful treatment." Keisha Williams nodded thoughtfully. "But that's exactly why it worked. You weren't performing for cameras or trying to create viral content. You were just being authentically yourself and standing up for your dignity." The Phoenix touched down smoothly at SFO, where the Global Dignity Summit would bring together advocates, business leaders, and government officials from around the world. Over 3 days, they would share strategies for combating discrimination, celebrate progress made since the Richard Blackwood incident, and plan future initiatives to ensure dignity and respect for all people in public spaces. As passengers began to disembark, Amara remained in seat 1A for a few extra moments. The worn leather seat had become a symbol of resistance, dignity, and the power of refusing to be moved when you know you belong where you are. Isabella approached one final time. "Ms. Davis, it's been an honor flying with you tonight, and thank you for everything you've done for our industry." Amara smiled, gathering her belongings, including the same battered Hermes bag that Richard had tried to grab 5 years earlier. She'd kept it exactly as it was that night, scuffs and all, as a reminder that dignity isn't about the price of your possessions, but about knowing who you are when someone tries to diminish you. "Thank you, Isabella, for everything you do to make travel more dignified for everyone." As Amara walked through the jet bridge into SFO, she was greeted by News Cruise Foundation staff and hundreds of summit attendees who'd gathered to welcome her. But the moment that moved her most was seeing a young black girl, maybe 10 years old, holding a sign that read, "Thank you for not moving." The child's mother approached with tears in her eyes. "My daughter has watched your speeches online. She says when kids at school try to make her feel like she doesn't belong, she thinks about you in seat 1A and remembers that dignity isn't negotiable." In that moment, Amara understood the true impact of that stormy night 5 years ago. Richard Blackwood had thought he was claiming a seat, but he'd accidentally sparked a global conversation about human worth and dignity. His racist assumptions had backfired so completely that they'd created the opposite of what he'd intended: a world where people of all backgrounds were more respected, more protected, and more empowered to stand their ground. As Amara walked toward her hotel, surrounded by the next generation of advocates and activists, she carried with her the quiet satisfaction of knowing that one moment of standing firm had created ripples of change that would continue long after she was gone. Seat 1A would always be hers, but more importantly, every seat in every public space was a little bit safer and more welcoming because she'd chosen to defend her dignity when it mattered most. The story of that stormy night had become more than viral content or a business school case study. It had become proof that individual courage captured at the right moment and shared with the world could bend the arc of justice toward dignity for all. The most expensive thing Richard Blackwood ever bought wasn't a luxury watch or a vacation home. It was the lesson that you never judge a person by their appearance, especially when that person might own the airplane you're sitting in. His mistake had cost him everything, but it had given millions of other people something invaluable: the knowledge that dignity is not negotiable, that respect is a human right, and that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is simply refusing to be moved. If you've made it this far, you've witnessed something powerful, a story about dignity, courage, and the consequences of judging people by their appearance rather than their character. This isn't just entertainment. It's a reminder that every one of us has the power to stand up for what's right. Have you ever been underestimated or dismissed because of how you look? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience matters, and your voice can inspire others to stand their ground when it counts. If this story moved, you hit that like button. It really helps us reach more people who need to hear these messages of justice and dignity. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss stories of people who refused to back down when facing prejudice and discrimination. Most importantly, share this video. Share it with someone who needs to remember their worth, someone who's ever been told they don't belong, or someone who has the power to make change in their workplace, school, or community. Because sometimes one person's courage to say no to injustice can create waves of change that reach far beyond what we can imagine. Remember, your dignity is not negotiable. Your worth is not determined by others' assumptions, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be moved from where you rightfully belong. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story of justice and inspiration.